Chapter 1. The promise that wouldn't die. Sean Myers had learned, over the years, that silence could be louder than raised voices. It was an insight he'd paid dearly for. 3 years, countless counseling sessions, and the quiet echo of a door closing behind Sara as she left their apartment without slamming it, without shouting, without giving him the argument he probably would have deserved. He could still see her standing there. She hadn't looked angry. That had been the worst part. "Sean," she had said, her voice soft in a way that used to comfort him and now made his chest ache just remembering it. "I love you, but I can't be the person you need me to be." He hadn't understood at the time. Not really. Back then, he thought love meant effort, direction, structure. He thought it meant anticipating every possible problem and fixing it before it existed. He thought being a husband meant being in control. He'd been wrong. Comprehensively, impressively wrong. And by the time he understood the difference between support and suffocation, she was already gone. "Let's sit with that for a moment." Dr. Hensley's voice gently interrupted the spiral forming in his thoughts. She always knew when he'd gone too far down the same well-worn path. Sean leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "I've been sitting with it for 3 years. And yet," she said, tilting her head slightly, "you still sound like you're hoping the past might reconsider its decision." Sean let out a quiet laugh. "I wish it would. I'd write it a very compelling letter." She smiled faintly, but didn't let him dodge. "You mentioned earlier that something came up this week. Something that's been persistent." Sean rubbed his hands together, buying himself a few seconds. "It's not something new. It's just louder now. Go on." He stared at the carpet for a second before speaking. "The honeymoon." Dr. Hensley didn't interrupt. "That was the first promise I made her," he continued. "We didn't have the money when we got married, but I told her. No, I announced it, like I was pitching a business plan to a room full of investors." He grimaced. "I said I was going to take her on an ocean cruise. Bahamas. Real fancy." Everyone clapped like I just invented vacations. "And you never went." "No," he said softly. "I kept thinking I'd get to it when everything else was handled first. Bills, work, stability. All the things I thought mattered more." He shook his head. "Turns out, the moment mattered more." Dr. Hensley leaned forward slightly. "And why does it feel so urgent now?" Sean hesitated. "Because I finally understand something I didn't back then," he admitted. "I thought making promises made me a good husband. I didn't understand that keeping them quietly mattered more than announcing them loudly." He exhaled again, slower this time. "And now it just sits there, like unfinished business. Not in a win-her-back way," he added quickly. "I'm not that guy anymore. I'm not trying to insert myself into her life like I'm the solution to it." "What are you trying to do?" Sean looked up. "I want to do one thing right," he said plainly. "Even if it doesn't change anything." The idea didn't leave him after that session. If anything, it grew. It followed him through his workday, hovered over his meals, lingered quietly when his apartment fell silent at night. At first, he tried to treat it like he treated most intrusive thoughts. Acknowledge it, let it pass, don't act impulsively. That lasted about 3 days. By day 4, he was researching cruise schedules. By day 5, he was comparing cabin options like a man who had accidentally become emotionally invested in ocean-facing balconies. By day 6, he noticed something that made him sit back in his chair and stare at his screen. Sara's birthday, 2 months away. The 3rd day of a 5-day Bahamas cruise. To fit together so cleanly it almost felt suspicious. "Okay," he muttered to himself. That's either fate or a very convenient coincidence." He didn't spend too long debating which. The booking agent on the phone sounded pleasantly surprised by his decisiveness. "2 cabins?" she repeated. "Yes," Sean said immediately. "Next to each other, if possible. Traveling together, but separately? That's the idea." There was a slight pause on the line, the kind where someone was professionally choosing not to ask follow-up questions. "Well," she said lightly, "we do have a premium deck with adjacent suites available." Sean closed his eyes for half a second, mentally calculating the cost. Then he remembered Sara's face the day she talked about travel. Years ago, sitting cross-legged on their living room floor, describing turquoise water like she'd already seen it. "I'll take it," he said. The envelope felt heavier than it should have. Sean turned it over in his hands as he sat in his car, parked outside Sara's apartment building. He hadn't called. He wasn't entirely sure why. Maybe because calling would give her time to prepare, and he didn't think there was any version of this conversation that felt natural even under ideal conditions. Maybe because he didn't want to lose his nerve. "Okay," he said quietly, gripping the steering wheel for a second. "You're not here to fix anything. You're not here to change her life. You're just keeping a promise." He nodded once, as if confirming it with himself, and stepped out of the car. The walk to her door felt longer than it was. When he knocked, the sound echoed just enough to make turning around seem like a reasonable option for approximately 2 seconds. Then the door opened. Sara stood there, framed in the doorway like a memory he hadn't asked permission to revisit. She looked the same in the ways that mattered, maybe a little more composed, a little steadier. There was that small smile, the one that used to appear when she was relaxed, when the world wasn't pressing in on her. It faded the moment she recognized him. "Sean?" she said, her brow furrowing slightly. "Is everything okay?" The question hit him harder than anything else she could have asked. He felt it in his chest. Even now, he managed a small smile. "Hello, Sara." She studied him for a moment longer, then stepped aside. "Come in." Her apartment was exactly what he expected. Lived in but orderly. Comfortable but intentional. Felt like her. They sat across from each other, the coffee table between them acting like a polite boundary neither of them acknowledged aloud. "Thank you for letting me drop by," Sean said. She nodded. "You said that already." He blinked. "Right. Sorry. I'm rehearsing and performing at the same time here." A hint of her old amusement flickered at the corner of her mouth. That helped more than he expected. So he didn't stall. He told her. Not everything, but enough. The counseling. The work he'd done. The realization that he had been the problem in ways he hadn't understood at the time. "I'm not here expecting anything from you," he said finally. "I just needed you to hear that from me directly." Sara stared at her hands for a long moment. When she looked up, her eyes were damp. "Thank you for saying that," she said quietly. He nodded. Then he reached into his jacket and placed the envelope on the table. "I made a promise to you," he said. "The first one, actually." She didn't hesitate. "The honeymoon." The warmth that spread through his chest caught him off guard. "You remember." "Of course I remember." He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Well," he said, nudging the envelope toward her, "I still owe you one." She didn't touch it yet. "It's a 5-day cruise to the Bahamas," he continued. "Your birthday is on the 3rd day." Her gaze flicked to his. "I booked separate cabins," he added quickly. "Next to each other but separate. No expectations. No assumptions." She opened her mouth to speak, but he raised a hand gently. "I'm not asking you to forgive anything," he said, "or revisit anything. This isn't that." He swallowed. "This is just me doing something I should have done a long time ago." Silence settled between them. Then he stood. "You've got time to decide," he said. "If you come, I'll be there. If you don't, I'll understand." He hesitated, then offered a small, sincere smile. "I hope I see you," he added. And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving his past, his promise, and his last hope for redemption sitting quietly on her coffee table. Chapter 2. The envelope. The envelope did not move. Sara sat on the couch long after the door had closed behind Sean, her hands folded in her lap as though they had forgotten their purpose. The room held its usual quiet, but something about it felt shifted, like a painting that had been nudged just slightly off-center. Not enough to notice at first glance, but impossible to unsee once you did. She looked at the envelope again. Still there. Still real. Still entirely unnecessary. "That was a terrible decision," she murmured to no one. The words lacked conviction. She leaned back against the cushions, exhaling slowly, and let her eyes close for just a moment. That was all she needed, or so she told herself. A moment to reset, to let the surprise drain out of her system so she could approach this rationally. Except rationally didn't feel like an option. Because rationally, she would never have let him in. Rationally, she would have asked him to leave the moment she saw him standing in her doorway, looking like a man who had practiced courage and still wasn't entirely convinced it would work. Rationally, she would not currently be sitting 3 feet away from a 5-day cruise to the Bahamas. She opened her eyes again. The envelope remained irritatingly calm about everything. "Don't look at me like that," she said, narrowing her gaze at it. It did not respond, which somehow made it worse. She stood abruptly and moved into the kitchen, if only to give herself a change of scenery. The routine helped. Glass, water, the quiet clink of something familiar and predictable. She leaned against the counter, taking a slow sip as she tried to organize her thoughts into something coherent. It wasn't the trip. Not really. A vacation, even an extravagant one, wasn't what made her pulse feel uneven. She had long ago learned how to say no to things that didn't fit into the life she had carefully built. And she had built one. That mattered. There had been a time, after the divorce, when everything had felt uncertain. Not chaotic, but hollow. Like she had spent so much energy adjusting to Sean's version of stability that she didn't immediately know what her own looked like. That had passed. She had a job she liked. A small circle of friends who didn't require her to monitor their reactions like she used to. A steady rhythm that belonged entirely to her. She was happy. Not loudly. Not in an overwhelming, cinematic kind of way. But consistently. Peacefully. And peace, she had learned, was harder to rebuild than happiness. So no, this wasn't about the trip. It was about him. About the way he had stood in her living room and spoken without trying to steer the conversation. About the way he had apologized without layering it in explanations or quiet justifications. About the way he had stopped himself from interrupting when she tried to respond. That had never been his strength before. She set the glass down carefully. "That doesn't mean anything," she said aloud, firmer this time. People changed. That was true. She believed that, in theory. But people also relapsed into old patterns the moment things became difficult. That part tended to be overlooked. Her phone buzzed on the counter, pulling her out of the spiral. She glanced at the screen. Maya. Sara huffed out a quiet laugh before answering. If this is about brunch tomorrow, I am still not waking up before 10. Wow. Maya's voice came through immediately, bright and suspicious. No greeting, no hello, just immediate hostility. What happened? Sara hesitated. Nothing, she said, which had always been a particularly ineffective word when speaking to Maya. Absolutely not, Maya replied. Your nothing has layers. I can hear at least 3 of them. Sara rubbed her forehead. Sean came by. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. He what? He came by, Sara repeated. About an hour ago. Are you okay? The question landed differently than it had when Sean asked it. Still gentle. But this time, it felt grounding instead of disorienting. I think so, Sara said slowly. That's not a no, Maya pointed out. What did he want? Sara glanced back toward the living room. He wanted to apologize, she said. And he did. Very thoroughly. And he left me something. Define something, Sara, because your tone suggests this isn't like a forgotten sweater. It's not a sweater. What is it? Sara exhaled. It's a cruise. Silence. Then, I'm sorry. I'm going to need you to repeat that as if you didn't just casually drop something insane into an otherwise normal sentence. Sara closed her eyes briefly. He booked a 5-day cruise to the Bahamas. For my birthday. Another stretch of silence. Longer this time. I'm coming over, Maya said decisively. You are not. I absolutely am. This feels like a situation that requires visual aids. It does not require visual aids. It might, Maya insisted. How fancy are we talking? Sufficiently. That's vague in a way I don't trust. Sara shook her head despite herself. It doesn't matter. That's not the point. Then what is the point? Sara didn't answer right away, because that was the problem. She didn't fully know. It's complicated, she said finally. Of course it is. It's you and Sean. You two invented complicated. Sara let out a breath that almost turned into a laugh. That's unfair. That's accurate, Maya corrected gently. Do you want to go? The question settled into the space between them. Sara stared at the doorway to the living room, where the envelope waited like an unopened chapter. I don't know, she admitted. Okay, Maya said. Then different question. If you take him out of the equation, just remove him entirely, would you want to go on that trip? Sara blinked. That's not hypothetical. Maya cut in. Play along. Sara hesitated. Then, reluctantly, she allowed herself to imagine it. Warm air. Open water. A few days without obligations or routines. She swallowed. Yes, she said quietly. All right, Maya said. So the trip isn't the issue. No, Sara admitted. Then it's him. Sara leaned against the counter, her voice softer now. It's what it represents. And what does it represent? She closed her eyes again, searching for the words she hadn't quite sorted yet. Risk, she said finally. Memory. A version of us that didn't work. Maya was quiet for a moment before responding. Or, she said carefully, it could represent closure. Sara opened her eyes. Or, Maya continued, it could represent something new, not the old version. Something different. Sara let out a quiet, skeptical breath. That sounds dangerously optimistic. I specialize in that, Maya said cheerfully. But I also specialize in knowing when you're overthinking something to avoid feeling it. I am not avoiding anything. You are standing in your kitchen instead of opening the envelope. Sara froze. That's circumstantial. It's illustrative. Sara sighed, pushing herself upright. Fine, she said. I'll open it. Stay on the phone. You don't trust me to accurately report back on paper contents? I trust you to narrate your internal monologue into a spiral, Maya said. This is preventative. Sara couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her mouth as she walked back into the living room. The envelope looked exactly the same. Calm, patient, unbothered. All right, she said, sitting down. I'm opening it. Finally. Sara slid her finger beneath the seal and pulled it open, slower than necessary. Inside, everything was neatly organized. Tickets, schedule, details. Sean hadn't rushed this. That much was obvious. Her gaze lingered on one line longer than the others. Day 3, birthday package. Prearranged. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. He planned it, she said softly. Of course he did, Maya replied. That man never did anything halfway for better or worse. Sara traced the edge of the paper. This didn't feel like control. It didn't feel like pressure. It felt deliberate, thoughtful in a way that didn't demand anything in return. That's new, she murmured. What is? He didn't ask for anything. Maya was quiet. That matters, she said after a moment. Sara nodded slowly. Even though Maya couldn't see it, it did matter. More than she wanted to admit. More than she was ready to fully understand. She looked down at the tickets again. at the possibility sitting quietly in her hands. I haven't decided yet, she said. You don't have to tonight. Sara swallowed. I know. But as she carefully set the contents back into the envelope, one thought settled in with an uncomfortable clarity. She was going to have to decide. And for the first time in a long time, it wasn't obvious what the right choice was. Chapter 3. The dock. Sean arrived early. He told himself it was practical. Boarding lines got chaotic, parking filled up, schedules ran tight. But none of that held much weight against the simple truth that sitting still at home had become unbearable sometime around midnight. So now he stood near the edge of the terminal, hands in his jacket pockets, watching luggage roll past like a parade of small, determined decisions. Families clustered together in loose, loud formations. Couples moved with quiet familiarity, instinctively leaning toward one another. A group of friends laughed too loudly at something that probably wasn't that funny, but it didn't matter. This was the kind of place where volume passed as excitement. He shifted his weight slightly and checked his watch. Still early. Good. He preferred early. Early meant there were fewer expectations. Early meant he could exist for a little while without needing to explain anything to anyone, especially her. A part of him, one he had spent a week arguing with, still tried to calculate her likelihood of showing up. It worked through variables like a stubborn algorithm. Time elapsed, emotional complexity, human unpredictability. It arrived at no meaningful conclusion, which, for once, he accepted. He had meant what he said. This wasn't about outcome. It was about the promise. Still, he found himself scanning every person who walked through the entrance. Not intentionally. It just happened. You look like a man waiting for either a very good day or a very bad one. Sean turned slightly at the voice beside him. A gray-haired man stood with an easy posture, one hand resting on the handle of his suitcase, watching the same flow of people with mild curiosity. Is it that obvious? Sean asked. Only if you've spent enough years in similar positions, the man replied, a small smile forming. Lived long enough, you start recognizing it. Sean let out a quiet breath, somewhere between a laugh and an admission. I'm trying not to categorize it at all. Bold strategy, the man said. How's it working out? Sean hesitated. Poorly. Ah, the man nodded. Then you're doing it right. Sean blinked. That doesn't feel correct. It rarely does, the man said. The big moments tend to feel like you're standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. He gestured toward the boarding area. You either step forward anyway, or you go home wondering what might have happened. Sean considered that. I already did the wondering part, he said quietly. The man studied him for a moment longer, then gave a knowing nod. Well then, no point repeating old chapters. Sean exhaled slowly. No, he agreed. No point. The line began to form gradually, like a tide pulling people into motion. Announcements crackled overhead, reminding passengers to have their documents ready, to check their boarding information, to proceed in an orderly manner that no one fully adhered to. Sean didn't move immediately. He stayed where he was, just outside the natural flow, his gaze drifting back to the entrance again. Less deliberately this time, more habitually hopeful. It had been 2 months. 2 months of not knowing. 2 months of reminding himself on repeat that silence was an answer too. That her not calling, not texting, not showing up at his door with questions or clarifications didn't mean anything beyond its own absence. He had lived his life in those 2 months. Worked, stayed consistent with his routines. Sat through counseling sessions where he talked about patience in ways that felt philosophical rather than practical. And still he was here, watching the door like it might rewrite history. He shook his head softly. Not helpful, he muttered to himself. Talking to yourself isn't always a bad sign, the gray-haired man offered, stepping slightly closer as the line nudged forward. Sometimes it just means you're the only one available for reasonable conversation. Sean huffed out a small laugh. That's a generous interpretation. I'm a generous man, the stranger replied easily. Name's Walter. Sean. Well, Sean, Walter said, extending his hand briefly. I hope your day leans toward the better side of the spectrum. Sean shook it, his grip firm but distracted. Me too. Walter tipped his head in a way that felt like both farewell and encouragement, then joined the line ahead. Sean stayed where he was a moment longer. Then he did something he hadn't expected. He stopped looking at the door, not because he didn't care, but because he finally understood that staring at it wouldn't change anything. He turned instead toward the ship, toward the reason he was here, toward the promise that didn't require a witness to matter. Excuse me. The voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Sean froze. Every muscle in his body seemed to recognize it before his mind caught up. Slowly, carefully, as though sudden movement might disrupt something fragile, he turned. Sara stood a few feet away. For a moment, everything else, the noise, the movement, the announcements, fell into the background. She looked different. Not in the sense that something about her had been altered beyond recognition, but in the way that time had settled into her, reshaped the way she carried herself. There was a steadiness there now, a kind of quiet confidence that didn't require effort to maintain. And still her. Hi, she said. It was such a simple word. Sean had never heard it carry so much weight. "Hi," he managed back. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Sara lifted her hand slightly, holding up a familiar envelope. This seemed like something I shouldn't ignore indefinitely. Sean exhaled, something in his chest finally loosening. "I'm really glad you didn't," he said. She gave a small, almost amused breath. "I considered it. I figured." They both smiled then, tentative, cautious, but real. And just like that, the moment shifted from impossible to happening. "You're early," she said after a beat, glancing around. "So are you." "I like to assess situations before committing to them," she replied. "That tracks." She tilted her head slightly. "You? I didn't trust myself to sit at home and pretend this was a normal day." "That also tracks." Her gaze flicked toward the ship, then back to him. "So, separate cabins?" "Yes," he said immediately. "Same floor, next to each other. But separate." She nodded. "Good. Good." "Yes," she said simply. "It helps." He didn't ask how. He didn't need to. They fell into step together, not quite side by side at first, but close enough that the distance felt intentional rather than accidental. The line moved faster now, pulling them forward in small increments. "This is strange," Sara admitted softly. Sean let out a quiet laugh. "That's a very polite word for it." She glanced at him. "What word are you using?" "I had a whole list," he said. "I've narrowed it down to unexpectedly hopeful, but in a way that could still go terribly wrong." She considered that. "That's more accurate," she said. "Thank you. But also less comforting." "I'm not here to comfort," he said lightly. "I'm here to fulfill a delayed obligation." She smiled at that. It wasn't the same smile as before, not entirely. It was different, perhaps a little more guarded, but also warmer somehow, and that mattered more than he wanted to admit. As they approached the check-in counter, Sara paused briefly, glancing at him. "One thing," she said. "Yeah." She met his eyes, steady and clear. "I'm not here to go backward." Sean didn't hesitate. "Neither am I." A flicker of something, relief, maybe, crossed her expression. "Okay," she said. And just like that, they stepped forward together. Chapter 4, Separate Cabins, Shared Gravity. The ship felt larger once they stepped onto it. That was Sean's first clear thought after boarding. How something so structured, so engineered, could feel oddly disorienting once you were inside it. Corridors stretched longer than expected. Ceilings arched slightly higher, and everything hummed faintly with motion even before the ship had begun to move. Beside him, Sara walked at an even pace, her carry-on rolling quietly behind her. She glanced around with a composed curiosity, taking things in without letting any of it show too strongly on her face. Sean noticed. He noticed everything now, it seemed. "That sign looks important," he said, gesturing toward a directory that listed deck numbers and amenities with an enthusiasm he suspected the ship did not personally feel. Sara followed his gaze. "It does. Do you want to pretend we know exactly where we're going?" She considered that for a moment. "No. Let's not start this trip on a lie." "That's fair." They both stepped closer to the directory, standing side by side, close enough that the space between them felt intentional rather than necessary. "Deck 9, Sara said, scanning the list. "Suites and something called Premium Leisure Corridor." "That sounds aggressively relaxing," Sean observed. "I'm suspicious of anything labeled Leisure Corridor," she replied. "Same." A small smile tugged at her mouth again. It wasn't forced. That mattered. The walk to their cabins was normal, which somehow made it feel even more unusual. They spoke intermittently. Brief comments, observations, small attempts at humor that neither of them overextended. It wasn't awkward in the way Sean had feared, but it wasn't effortless either. It was new, careful but not strained. "Here we go," Sean said, stopping outside 2 adjacent doors. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the key cards he'd been handed minutes earlier. "These are yours," he said, offering one to her. She took it, glancing briefly at the number before looking at the doors. "Next to each other," she said. "As advertised. Efficient." "I try." There was a pause. Not uncomfortable, just present. "Do you want to?" Sean started, then stopped himself. "No, we don't need to plan everything immediately." Sara tilted her head slightly. "You were about to suggest a schedule, weren't you?" He winced. It was a soft suggestion. It sounded like a spreadsheet in verbal form. "That's hurtful," he said mildly. The spreadsheet would have had color coding. She laughed, quiet, but unmistakable. It was the first fully unguarded sound he'd heard from her since this began. Something in his chest shifted. Not hope exactly, but something adjacent to it. "I'm going to get settled," she said after a moment, holding up her key card. "And recalibrate." "That seems wise," he said. "I will also recalibrate." "Good." Another pause lingered, this one longer, more deliberate. "We'll see each other," she added, not phrasing it as a question. "Yeah," he said. "We will." And with that, they each turned toward their respective doors. Sean's cabin was exactly what he had expected. Spacious enough to feel intentional, polished in a way that made everything seem slightly elevated beyond necessity. The balcony doors stood open just enough to let in a steady breeze, carrying the faint scent of salt water. He set his bag down and stood there for a moment, hands on his hips, taking it in. "This is real," he muttered to himself. It hadn't quite been until now. The planning had been real. The invitation had been real. But this was something else. This was momentum. He walked toward the balcony and stepped outside, resting his hands on the railing. Below, crew members moved with practiced efficiency, final preparations folding seamlessly into one another as passengers continued to board. Somewhere nearby, music drifted faintly into the air. Light, upbeat, something designed to make people feel like they were already having a good time, whether or not they were ready to. Sean exhaled slowly. "She showed up," he said quietly. It wasn't a revelation, but it felt like one. Sara stood in her own cabin, the door closing softly behind her. For a moment, she didn't move. Then she set her suitcase down, took a few steps forward, and turned slowly in a full circle. It was beautiful. That was the simplest way to put it. The space opened toward the balcony, sunlight spilling across polished surfaces in a way that felt effortless rather than staged. She walked toward the glass doors and stepped outside. The ocean stretched endlessly in front of her, a quiet blue expanse that seemed both grounding and overwhelming at the same time. She rested her hands lightly on the railing. "This was a terrible idea," she murmured. The words came easily, automatically. They didn't feel entirely true. That was the problem. A knock sounded lightly at her door. Sara turned, hesitation flickering across her face before she moved to answer it. When she opened it, Sean stood there, looking mildly apologetic. "I promise this isn't the start of a pattern," he said. There's a safety thing happening on the top deck. Required attendance. I figured we could either go separately and pretend we didn't coordinate, or walk there together like functional adults." She blinked at him. "There's a safety presentation. Apparently, the ship prefers we understand how not to panic in an organized fashion." Sara considered him for a second, then stepped out into the hallway, pulling her door closed behind her. "Together is fine," she said. "Great," he replied, relief flickering briefly across his features before he tucked it away. "Functional adults it is." The safety briefing was exactly as described, structured, slightly overly enthusiastic, filled with instructions delivered in tones that suggested both urgency and confidence in the audience's ability to misinterpret them. Sara stood beside Sean as they listened, arms loosely crossed, attention drifting in and out as demonstrations played out. "When they say, 'calmly proceed,'" Sean murmured under his breath, "I always wonder who's being evaluated in that moment. Like, is there a hidden panel scoring our calmness?" Sara kept her gaze forward, but her lips curved slightly. "You would take a life-threatening scenario and turn it into a performance review. Only if there's a chance to improve my score." "That tracks." They fell quiet again, the conversation fading naturally rather than abruptly. It was easy. Not in the sense that everything felt resolved or uncomplicated, but in the sense that nothing they said seemed to carry unintended weight. That was new. After the briefing, the deck began to clear as people dispersed in different directions. Some toward bars, others toward dining areas, a few toward quieter corners of the ship where the novelty could settle without interruption. Sean glanced at Sara. "So," he said, tone casual, "what's the protocol now?" "Protocol? Yeah. Are we scheduling interactions? Running into each other organically? Pretending this is a coincidence until it becomes inconvenient?" Sara let out a breath that bordered on laughter. "There is no protocol," she said. "That seems inefficient. That seems human." He nodded, accepting that. "Okay," he said. "Then, would you like to get something to eat? No pressure. Just food." She hesitated. Not because she didn't understand the question, but because she did. This right here was the real beginning. Not the invitation. Not the decision to come. The first choice made within the space they now shared. She studied him briefly. He didn't rush her. Didn't fill the silence. Didn't try to sway the outcome. He just waited. Sara exhaled slowly. "Food sounds reasonable," she said. Relief flickered across his expression again. Quieter this time. "Good," he replied. "I've been told ships are known for that." "They are," she said dryly. "It's one of their primary selling points." "Excellent. Then we are aligning with expectations." She shook her head faintly as they began to walk. And though the space between them remained careful, intentional, respected, it no longer felt like distance. Felt like something moving, slowly, steadily, inevitably, toward something neither of them was quite ready to define. Chapter 5. The Storm, Internal and External. The ocean changed its mind overnight. That was the only way Sara could describe it. The previous evening had been calm, almost deceptively so. The water had stretched out in smooth, uninterrupted blue, the horizon blending into the sky with little distinction. It had felt steady, predictable, safe. By morning, the illusion had vanished. Sara stood on the balcony, arms folded lightly against the chill that hadn't been there before, watching the water shift in restless, uneven swells. The sky above it was heavier now, clouds gathering in layered shades of gray that seemed undecided about whether they wanted to hold or break. The ship itself moved differently too. Not dramatically, not dangerously, but enough that you noticed. A subtle rise and fall, a gentle sway that reminded you that control, out here, was always an agreement, never a guarantee. This feels symbolic, she murmured to herself. Behind her, her phone buzzed lightly on the small table. She hesitated, glancing back at it, then turned fully and stepped inside. The message was from Sean. Weather looks ambitious. Want to grab coffee before the ship starts pretending this is all part of the plan? She stared at the screen for a moment longer than necessary. Then she typed, coffee sounds reasonable. Where? The reply came quickly. There's a cafe on deck 6, also labeled relaxation zone, which feels optimistic given current conditions. Sara exhaled through her nose. I'll meet you there. She set the phone down and glanced back toward the ocean one more time. The waves hadn't calmed. Neither, she noticed, had the quiet tension sitting just beneath the surface of her thoughts. Sean was already at the cafe when she arrived. He had claimed a small table by the window, strategic, she guessed, for equal parts view and distraction. A cup of coffee sat in front of him, untouched, his fingers loosely wrapped around it as though he'd forgotten it was there. He looked up as she approached. Hey, hey, she replied, sliding into the seat opposite him. For a moment, they both glanced automatically toward the window. The ship tilted slightly, not enough to cause concern, but enough that the movement registered. Ambitious, Sara said, echoing his earlier message. Sean nodded. Very confident ocean. Seems like a lot of commitment for a Tuesday. Definitely overachieving. They let the humor sit between them for a second before it softened into something quieter. You slept okay? He asked. She nodded. Better than I expected. Same, he said, then gave a small, self-aware shrug. Which feels suspicious. Because nothing about this should be easy, she offered. Exactly. A server passed by, and Sara ordered coffee without much thought, her voice steady even as the ship shifted again beneath them. They fell into silence briefly, not uncomfortable, but heavier than it had been the night before. Outside, the wind picked up, sending ripples across the already uneven water. Sara watched it for a moment, then spoke without looking at him. I used to hate storms. Sean leaned back slightly. Used to? Yeah, she said. Now I think they're honest. He considered that. How so? They don't pretend to be something else, she said simply. They don't ease into it, don't soften the edges. They just happen. She finally glanced at him. And you deal with them the way you deal with them. Sean nodded slowly. That sounds like something you didn't always believe. No, she admitted. I used to think you could manage everything if you were careful enough. If you anticipated enough variables. Sean let out a quiet breath. Same. Her gaze lingered on him for a moment. Then she looked back toward the window again. That didn't work out particularly well, she said. No, he agreed. There was no defensiveness in his tone. No quiet attempt to redirect the conversation. Just acknowledgement. That, more than anything, made her shift slightly in her seat. The ship gave a slightly stronger sway, drawing a few glances from other passengers around them. Sean reached for his coffee then, finally taking a sip. So, he said lightly, though his tone carried intent, are we going to talk about it? Or are we letting the weather handle metaphors for us today? Sara let out a small breath that bordered on a laugh. You're not subtle. I'm trying not to be strategic, he said. It feels safer. She tilted her head. Safer for who? Both of us, he said, meeting her gaze. She held it. There was no push behind his words. No expectation. Just openness. And that made it harder. All right, she said after a moment. We can talk about it. The decision settled between them, not as a rupture, but as a shift. What part? He asked gently. Sara considered that. Then she said the thing she'd been circling around since she opened the envelope. I can't go back to who I was with you, she said. The words landed firmly, without hesitation. Sean nodded immediately. I wouldn't ask you to. And I won't stay in a situation where I feel like I'm being managed, she continued, her voice steady now. Or directed. Or adjusted to fit someone else's expectations. You shouldn't, he said. I mean it, she added, her gaze sharpening slightly. Not even subtly. Not in the name of concern or care. I can't. She stopped briefly, searching for the right phrasing. I can't live like that again. Sean didn't interrupt, didn't flinch. He just listened. And when she finished, he waited a second, giving the silent space instead of rushing to fill it. I understand, he said finally. You didn't before, she said quietly. No, he admitted. I didn't. Another slight sway passed through the ship, but neither of them reacted to it this time. I thought I was being responsible, he continued. I thought if I could keep everything structured, nothing would fall apart. He let out a quiet breath. I didn't realize I was the thing making it fall apart. Sara watched him closely. Not for the words, for the way he held them. There was no defensiveness. No attempt to soften the truth into something more comfortable. Just ownership. That doesn't fix it, she said softly. I know, he said. Another pause. I'm not trying to fix what already happened, he added. I'm trying to not repeat it. Something in that, simple as it was, shifted slightly inside her. Not enough to change anything, but enough to register. The storm outside deepened. Rain began in thin streaks against the window, quickly transitioning into something heavier, more insistent. The ocean below it responded in kind, waves lifting and rolling with more force now, their rhythm less predictable. Inside the cafe, conversations softened. People leaned closer to one another, voices dropping instinctively as the outside world grew louder. Sara looked down at her hands, then back up at him. I wanted something simple, she said. With us. With life, she clarified. Stability. Space to grow into something without having to constantly adjust to it. Sean nodded. I didn't know how to give you that, he said. Back then, I thought building something meant controlling it. And now? She asked. He smiled faintly. Now I think building something means allowing it to exist without trying to own it. She studied him. That sounded right. Dangerously right. Do you actually believe that? She asked. Or is that something that sounds good after a few years of therapy? He let out a soft laugh. Both, he admitted. I believe it because I've tested the alternative and it failed spectacularly. A small breath escaped her, almost a laugh. Fair. Another swell rolled beneath the ship, stronger this time. Maybe we should head somewhere less dynamic, Sean suggested, glancing toward the window. Sara shook her head slightly. No, she said. It's fine. She met his eyes again. I'm not running from storms anymore. Something in the way she said it carried more than the literal meaning. Sean recognized that. And instead of responding, instead of analyzing or unpacking it, he nodded. That was it. Just acceptance. And for the first time since they sat down, the tension between them didn't feel like something waiting to break. It felt like something being worked through. Not solved. Not resolved. But understood. Piece by piece. Wave by wave. Chapter 6. The birthday, the storm didn't last. Not in the way it had threatened to. By the time the second evening settled into night, the sky had begun to clear in uneven patches, as though the clouds had simply grown tired of holding their position. The ocean followed reluctantly, its surface calming from restless peaks into long, rolling swells that felt less like resistance and more like release. By morning, the change was complete. Sara stepped onto her balcony and paused. The horizon stretched clean and uninterrupted, the water catching sunlight in shifting ribbons of blue and gold. The air was warmer again, softer, like the world had decided to forgive itself overnight. She let out a slow breath. Show off, she murmured to the ocean. Behind her, the room remained quiet. The stillness no longer tense but expectant in a way she hadn't fully named yet. Her phone buzzed lightly on the bedside table. She didn't need to check it to know who it was. Still, she waited a moment before picking it up. Happy birthday, the message read. No pressure, there's breakfast on the upper deck whenever you feel like facing the day. Sara stared at the words. No fanfare, no insistence, no subtle attempt to orchestrate her response. Just there. She smiled faintly, something soft and unfamiliar settling behind it. Then she typed back, I suppose I can tolerate breakfast. The reply came almost instantly. Brave. The upper deck was already alive with quiet motion when she arrived. Not crowded, just present. People moved through the space in unhurried rhythms, conversations blending into the background along with the low hum of the ship cutting through the water. Sean stood near the railing, one hand resting lightly against it as he looked out toward the horizon. He turned when she approached, and just for a second, one unguarded, unmistakable second, his expression lit in a way that caught her entirely off guard. Hey, he said. Hey. He gestured lightly toward a small table nearby. I took the liberty of securing a strategic location. Sara glanced at it. Strategic. Optimal sunlight, minimal foot traffic, strong potential for uninterrupted coffee consumption. She nodded approvingly. Important metrics. I've refined them over time. They moved toward the table together, falling into step with an ease that still surprised her. Breakfast arrived quickly, but neither of them immediately focused on it. Instead, they sat for a moment, letting the quiet settle. This is nice, Sara said finally, her gaze drifting over the ocean. Sean followed her line of sight. It is. She tilted her head slightly, looking at him. No presentation, she added. No speech, he said. No overly planned reveal. I had one drafted, he admitted. It didn't make the final cut. She raised an eyebrow. Good decision. Agreed, he said. A small smile moved between them, shared, uncomplicated. And then, without warning, the moment deepened. Thank you, she said softly. He looked at her, not speaking. For this, she continued, gesturing lightly toward the space around them. The ship, the morning, the quiet intention sitting beneath it all. Not just the trip, The way you've handled it. Sean nodded once. I meant what I said, he replied. No expectations. I know, she said. That was what made it difficult. If he had pushed even slightly, if there had been any trace of the old urgency, the old need to steer things, this would have been easier to dismiss. But he hadn't. He'd stayed. Consistent. Present. And it left her with something she hadn't expected to face. Choice. After breakfast, Sean stood, brushing his hands lightly together. So, he said, glancing at her. I believe this is the part where I let you have your day. Sara frowned slightly. You're leaving. Temporarily, he clarified. I figured you might want space to enjoy your birthday without this. He gestured vaguely between them. She considered that. It was thoughtful, appropriate. And yet, no, she said. Sean blinked. No, I don't want you to disappear for the day, she said, her tone steady. That feels strange. We're already here. He studied her for a second. You're sure? She nodded. Yes. A small shift moved through his expression. Not quite relief, not quite surprise. Okay, he said. I can work with that. The morning unfolded without structure. And somehow that worked. They walked the deck, occasionally stopping to watch something that caught their attention. A group of passengers attempting to take a coordinated photo and failing spectacularly. A crew member balancing a tray with impressive casual precision. The endless motion of the water below. At one point, Sara paused near the railing again, resting her hands against it. You were wrong about one thing, she said. Sean leaned beside her. Only one. For now, she said dryly. I'll take it. She glanced at him. This doesn't feel like going backward, she said. Something in his posture shifted. Not visibly, not dramatically, but enough that she noticed. That's good, he said quietly. It feels. She hesitated, searching for the right word. Separate. Separate from what? From who we were, she said. He nodded slowly. I was hoping for that. She turned back toward the ocean. Me too. The afternoon came and went in pieces. Light conversation, comfortable pauses, moments where neither of them felt the need to fill the space just to prove it still existed. And as the sun began its descent, painting the horizon in deeper tones, Sean checked the time. I'm going to need about 10 minutes, he said. Sara tilted her head. Why? For a thing. What kind of thing? A birthday-adjacent thing. She raised an eyebrow. That's vague in a way I don't trust. That's fair, he admitted. But it's not a spectacle. Better not be. It's not, he assured her. I learned my lesson about grand gestures. That earned a faint smile. All right, she said. 10 minutes. When he returned, he found her waiting exactly where he'd left her. He handed her a small card. Not elaborate, not overly decorated. Just simple. She took it, glancing up at him once before opening it. Inside, his handwriting was unmistakable. I promised you a honeymoon. I didn't understand then what that meant. I thought it had to be big, impressive, worth announcing. I was wrong. It just had to be real. Happy birthday, Sara. She read it twice. Then slowly, she lowered the card. This is the part where you reveal something dramatic, isn't it? She said, her voice softer now. Sean shook his head. No reveal, he said, and then he stepped back slightly, giving her space. Confused, she turned. A small table had been set a few feet away, nothing extravagant, nothing overwhelming. Just 2 plates, a simple cake, and a single candle catching the last light of the setting sun. No audience, no announcement, no performance, just something quiet, something meant for her. Sara felt something tighten in her chest. Not pressure, not expectation, something else. Sean, she said, turning back to him. He met her gaze, steady. I kept the promise, he said simply. That's all this is. She looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time since this began, she saw it clearly. Not the man he had been, not the version shaped by control or certainty, but the man standing in front of her now, present, careful, willing to let the moment exist without trying to define it. Her throat tightened slightly. You did, she said. He nodded. Yeah. The candle flickered softly in the space between them. Sara stepped forward slowly. Just one step, then another, until the distance closed, not entirely, not completely, but enough that it no longer felt like something they were maintaining out of necessity. This was right, she said quietly. Sean didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to, because for the first time, neither of them felt like they were trying to catch up to something that had already been lost. They were simply there, at the start of something new, even if neither of them had said it yet. Chapter 7, the almost goodbye. The last morning arrived too quietly. Sara noticed it before she even opened her eyes. There was something different about the rhythm of the ship, not slower exactly, but intentional. The steady hum beneath everything felt directed now, purposeful in a way that suggested an ending rather than a continuation. She lay still for a moment, staring up at the ceiling as the realization settled in. This was it. 5 days had passed, not in a blur, Not in the way time sometimes collapsed into itself when moments weren't fully lived, but steadily, distinctly. Each day had been its own thing. Each conversation had built on the last without repeating it. And now they were almost back. She pushed herself up slowly and walked to the balcony. The coastline wasn't visible yet, but she knew it was there, just beyond the horizon, waiting in that quiet, inevitable way that endings tend to have. This was temporary, she reminded herself softly. It had always been temporary. That had been the agreement, spoken and unspoken. She exhaled, letting the truth settle. The problem wasn't that it was ending. The problem was that she didn't know what came after. Sean was already awake. He had been for at least an hour, though he hadn't done much beyond pacing once, sitting twice, and ultimately deciding that both activities were equally unhelpful. Now he leaned against the railing of his balcony, watching the same horizon Sara had been staring at minutes earlier. He'd known this part was coming. Of course he had. From the moment she stepped onto the dock. From the moment he made the choice to let this be what it was without trying to shape it into something else. There had always been an endpoint, a clear, unavoidable shift back into their separate lives. He had accepted that. He had. But acceptance didn't mean the weight of it felt any lighter. "She doesn't owe you anything," he murmured under his breath. The words weren't new. He'd said them to himself more than once over the last few days, especially in the quieter moments when things felt easy. Too easy. He straightened slightly, running a hand through his hair. This was about the promise, he added. And it had been. Still was. But somewhere between the storm, the conversations, the quiet space they had learned not to rush, something had shifted. Not backward. Not into what they'd had before. Something new. And that made this part harder than he'd expected. They met in the hallway without planning to. Sara stepped out of her cabin at the exact moment Sean was doing the same, both of them pausing mid-motion in a way that would have been comical if it didn't feel so deliberate. "Hey," he said. "Hey." For a second, neither of them moved. Then Sara gave a small, almost amused breath. "We're very good at timing." "Years of practice," he replied. "With coincidental exits?" "With avoiding direct coordination," he said. She smiled faintly. There was something softer about it now, and something quieter. "Were you heading somewhere?" she asked. "Not specifically," he said. "You?" She shook her head. "No." Another pause. Short. Not uncomfortable. Just reflective. "Coffee?" he offered. She nodded. Coffee. The cafe was calmer than it had been during the storm. Quieter. The kind of quiet that came when people were beginning to shift mentally toward departure. Conversations more subdued, movements less exploratory, everything angled slightly toward conclusion. They found a table by the window again. Felt familiar now. "That's new," Sara said, glancing at the space around them. "What is? This feels familiar." Sean followed her gaze. "Yeah," he said. "It does." She wrapped her hands around her cup, staring down at it for a moment before speaking again. "I used to hate endings," she said. Sean tilted his head slightly. "Used to." She let out a quiet breath. "I think I still do," she admitted. "I just understand them better now." He nodded. "Yeah," he said. "Same." They sat with that for a moment. Then Sara looked up at him. "This wasn't what I expected," she said. "The trip. All of it." Sean gave a small, careful smile. "That makes two of us. I thought it would feel." She hesitated, searching for the word. "Complicated." "It isn't," he asked. "It is," she said. "Just not in the way I thought it would be." He considered that. "What way is it?" Sara met his eyes directly. "Clear," she said. The word landed between them, simple but precise. Sean didn't respond immediately, because he understood exactly what she meant, and he wasn't sure how to respond without changing it. They walked the deck one last time after that. No rush. No attempt to stretch the moment beyond what it was. Just movement. Side by side, matching pace without needing to think about it. The coastline appeared gradually, a thin line at first, then something more defined. Buildings, structures, the return of a world that existed beyond the contained space they had occupied for 5 days. Sara stopped at the railing, resting her hands against it. "We're almost there," she said. "Yeah." He stepped up beside her, leaving the same careful distance he had maintained all week. "Sean," she said. It wasn't a heavy tone, but it carried intention. He turned slightly toward her. "I don't want this to turn into something confusing," she continued. "When we get back." He nodded. "Okay. I don't want assumptions," she added. "Or expectations that aren't spoken." "Fair," he said. "And I don't want to feel like I'm being pulled into something I haven't agreed to." "You won't be," he said immediately. She held his gaze for a second longer. "I believe you," she said. That meant more than she probably realized. Or maybe she did. The ship slowed, barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't paying attention. But they both felt it. "Can I say something?" Sean asked. She nodded. "Of course." He paused briefly, not to gather courage, but to make sure the words were right. "This mattered to me," he said. "Not because I thought it would lead somewhere, but because it was honest. Sarah's expression softened slightly. It mattered to me too, she said. That was enough. More than enough. They didn't rush the disembarkation. There was no reason to. No urgency to be first in line. No desire to turn this into something abrupt. When it was time, they moved with the flow of passengers, the shared rhythm carrying them forward without resistance. The dock came into view. Solid, certain, real. And just like that, the contained space of the ship gave way to everything that existed outside of it. They stepped off together, and then stopped, not because they didn't know where to go, but because this was the moment neither of them had fully prepared for. Sara turned to him. Sean met her gaze. 1,000 possible things sat unspoken between them, but neither of them reached for them. Not yet. Thank you, she said. He nodded. You don't have to say that. I want to. A small pause. Then, I'll call you, she added. Not a promise. Not a guarantee. Just possibility. Sean smiled. Okay, he said. And for once, he didn't try to define what that meant. He just let it exist, as it was, unfinished, and real. Chapter 8, The Return. The city felt louder than she remembered. Sara noticed it the second she stepped onto the sidewalk. Cars passing too quickly, voices overlapping without rhythm. The constant hum of everything continuing exactly as it had before she left. For a moment, she stood there with her suitcase in hand, watching the world move without her. It hadn't stopped. Of course it hadn't. 5 days wasn't long enough to disrupt anything beyond herself. That makes sense, she murmured, adjusting her grip. But something in her chest resisted the simplicity of that explanation. Because while the world hadn't changed, she had. Not dramatically. Not in some sweeping, cinematic transformation. But enough. Enough that standing here on the edge of her normal life felt slightly unfamiliar. She exhaled and started walking. Her apartment greeted her exactly as she'd left it. Clean, quiet, predictable, safe. Sara set her suitcase down and moved through the space slowly, her fingers brushing lightly against surfaces as though verifying that everything was still real. It was. Nothing had shifted. Nothing needed to. And yet, she stopped in the center of the living room, her gaze landing on the empty coffee table. The same place where the envelope had sat weeks ago. The same place where everything had started again without asking permission to. She crossed her arms loosely, staring at it for a moment longer. You said you didn't want confusion, she reminded herself. Her voice sounded steady, reasonable, and entirely insufficient, because clarity, real clarity, was rarely quiet. Across the city, Sean unpacked his suitcase with the focused determination of someone trying very hard not to think about anything else. Shirts folded, shoes aligned, the small, controlled organization of objects becoming a substitute for sorting through everything still unresolved in his head. It was enough, he said aloud, placing the last item into his drawer. And it had been. He meant that. The promise had been honored. The conversations had been real. Nothing had been forced beyond what it could naturally hold. That mattered. Everything beyond that, he shook his head slightly. She doesn't owe you anything, he repeated. The words landed the same way they always had. Clear, correct, and deeply inconvenient. 3 days passed. 3 days of returning to routine, of stepping back into lives that had continued without interruption. Sara went to work, answered emails, met Maya for coffee, where she offered a version of events that was honest but carefully contained. Carefully contained? Maya repeated, raising an eyebrow. You just spent 5 days on a ship with your ex-husband, and you're summarizing it like a quarterly report. I'm being concise, Sara said. You're being evasive. Sara looked down at her cup, turning it slightly in her hands. I don't know what it means yet, she said quietly. Maya leaned back, studying her. That's not the same as not knowing what you want. Sara didn't respond, because that part felt dangerously close to something she wasn't ready to say out loud. Sean returned to work as well. Routine came easier to him. It always had. Lists, tasks, structure, things he could complete. Back from vacation? One of his coworkers asked casually, leaning against the edge of his desk. Sean glanced up. Yeah. How was it? He paused. Good, he said. It wasn't inaccurate, but it wasn't complete. His coworker nodded. You look like someone who had a good time. Sean huffed out a small breath. That's one interpretation. Another one? Sean hesitated, then shook his head. I'm still figuring that out. His coworker grinned. That sounds less relaxing. Yeah, Sean said softly. It kind of was. It happened on the 4th day. Not because of something dramatic. Not because of a sudden realization that demanded immediate action. But because Sara reached a point where not deciding felt worse than the risk of being wrong. She stood in her apartment, phone in hand, staring at the screen. Sean's name sat there. Familiar. Uncomplicated in its simplicity. Her thumb hovered for a second. Then she pressed call. Sean answered on the second ring. Hey. His voice was steady, calm, like he hadn't been waiting. Hey, she said. There was a brief silence, not awkward, just real. I wasn't sure if I should call, she admitted. You didn't have to, he said. I know. Another pause. But I wanted to. Something shifted quietly on the other end of the line. Okay, he said. They met at a small park halfway between their apartments. Neutral ground. Unintentional. Exactly right. Sara arrived first this time. She stood near a bench, watching the late afternoon light settle across the grass in long, quiet stretches. When Sean approached, she didn't turn immediately. She waited until he was close enough to speak. Hi, she said, turning then. Hi. They stood facing each other for a moment, the space between them familiar in a way that no longer felt uncertain, just chosen. I'm going to say this directly, Sara began. That would be helpful, Sean replied. A faint smile flickered across her face before it faded into something more serious. I don't want to go back, she said. Sean nodded immediately. I know. I mean it, she continued. Not to what we were. Not to who we were. I wouldn't want that either, he said. That gave her pause. You wouldn't. No, he said simply. That version of us didn't work. I think we both know that. She studied him for a second, then nodded slowly. Okay, she said. A breath passed between them. Not tense. Not heavy. Just necessary. I also don't know what this is, she admitted. Sean's mouth curved slightly. Same. But, she added, her voice steadier now, I know that what happened on that trip wasn't an accident. He held her gaze. I agree. And I know I don't want to ignore it, she said. That landed. Carefully. Deliberately. Sean didn't move. Didn't step forward. Didn't reach for anything that hadn't been offered. What are you asking? He said gently. Sara exhaled. I'm asking if we can start again, she said. Not as a continuation. Not as a second attempt at the same thing. Something new. Sean was quiet for a moment. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because he understood what she was offering, and what she wasn't. No expectations, he said. She nodded. No expectations. No control, he added. None, she confirmed. Just seeing what this is. Yes, he let out a slow breath, then smiled. Not the guarded, careful version he had worn for most of the trip. Something lighter. Something real. I'd like that, he said. Relief flickered across her expression. Quick, but unmistakable. Okay, she said. They stood there for a moment longer. Neither of them moving. Neither of them rushing to define the next step. Because for the first time they didn't need to. Do we shake on it? Sean asked after a beat. Sara blinked. What? This feels like an agreement, he said. I'm trying to determine the appropriate closing protocol. She stared at him, then laughed. Fully. Easily. The sound cutting through everything that had come before it. No, she said. We don't shake on it. Right, he said. Too formal. Definitely too formal. He considered that for a second. Coffee, he offered. Sara smiled. Coffee sounds reasonable. They fell into step together again. Not because they had before, but because they chose to. And this time, there was no promise hanging over them. No past pulling at their decisions. Just two people, side by side, moving forward into something undefined. And finally, for the first time, that felt like exactly enough. Epilogue. 5 years later. The first thing Sean noticed was that the ocean never looked the same twice. He had tried, early on, to believe otherwise, to assume that water was just water, a constant surface that behaved exactly as expected. But over time, and over 5 years of returning to it again and again, he'd learned something simpler and far more meaningful. The ocean didn't repeat itself. It reflected. Whether light, time, mood, it shifted in response to everything around it. And somehow, every time he stood at the railing with Sara beside him, it felt like it was responding to them, too. Stop thinking, Sara said from behind him. Sean blinked, pulling himself out of the quiet drift he hadn't realized he'd slipped into. He turned halfway, leaning back against the railing. I wasn't thinking, he lied calmly. She stepped up beside him, resting her hands in the same spot his had occupied seconds earlier. You were definitely thinking. You get that look. What look? The one where you're narrating something in your head like a documentary voiceover. That's wildly inaccurate. She tilted her head slightly. You're doing it again. He paused, then exhaled. Okay, he admitted. I might have been thinking a little. She smirked. About the ocean, he said. Her expression didn't change. That's either very poetic, she replied, or a strategic attempt to avoid answering the question. Both can be true. They usually are with you. Sean smiled faintly, glancing back out at the water. I was just thinking how it's always different. The ocean. Yeah. Sara followed his gaze, her expression softening slightly as she took in the view. Good, she said. He looked back at her. Good. Yes, she said. It would be weird if it stayed the same while everything else changed. He considered that for a moment, then nodded. Yeah, he said quietly. It would. The tradition had started without discussion. The first year after the cruise, they hadn't planned anything. No expectations, no assumptions. just the steady, careful rhythm of building something new from the ground up. It had taken months before either of them even mentioned travel again. And when Sara did, it wasn't a grand suggestion. Just a quiet, almost offhand comment one evening. "My birthday's coming up." Sean had looked up from whatever he was doing at the time, something small and irrelevant now, and met her eyes. "Yeah," he said. She held his gaze for a second. "We don't have to do anything," she added. He nodded. "Okay," he said. Pause. Then, "Do you want to?" Her mouth had curved slightly. Maybe. That had been enough. 5 years later, they didn't pretend anymore. Didn't act like the trip was spontaneous or accidental. Sara had booked this one herself, choosing the same general route, the same kind of ship, even the same time of year. When Sean noticed, he'd said nothing. Just smiled slightly and packed his bag. "You could acknowledge it," she said now, nudging him lightly with her shoulder. "Acknowledge what?" "That we've turned this into a thing." "I don't know what you're referring to." "Sean." "Yes. This is our 5th cruise." "That feels exaggerated." "It's not." He tilted his head as though considering this for the first time. "So it is." She stared at him. "You're impossible." "That's not new information." She huffed out a laugh, shaking her head as she turned back to the ocean. "That you tolerate me anyway is deeply appreciated," he added. "I don't tolerate you," she said, her voice lighter now. "That implies effort." "Oh," he said. "That's worse." It's accurate. Their relationship hadn't followed a straight line. That would have been too simple. Too much like the version of life Sean used to believe he could engineer if he just made enough rules. It had been built differently. Conversation by conversation. Boundary by boundary. Moment by moment. He had learned to listen, not as a strategy, not as something to check off a mental list, but as a way of understanding something that wasn't his to define. And when he spoke, he chose his words carefully. Not because he was afraid of saying the wrong thing, but because he understood now that words had weight. They weren't tools to direct. They were bridges. Sara noticed the difference. Not all at once, but over time in the consistency of it. In the way he paused instead of interrupting. In the way he asked instead of assumed. In the way he showed up, present, steady, without trying to shape what didn't belong to him. She trusted that. Eventually, completely, the sun had begun to set, casting the ocean in deeper shades of gold and rose. The air had cooled slightly, the breeze carrying just enough movement to remind them where they were. "This one's nice," Sara said. "They're all nice," Sean replied. "Don't generalize," she said. "I'm appreciating a pattern." "Appreciate this one specifically," she corrected. He nodded, adjusting accordingly. "This one is exceptionally nice." "Better." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment longer. Then Sara glanced at him. "You're doing it again." "Thinking." "Yes." He exhaled, a quiet smile pulling at the edge of his mouth. "Yeah," he said. "About." He hesitated. Not long. Just enough to make sure he wasn't rushing the moment. "Us," he said finally. Sara's expression shifted, subtle, but noticeable. "What about us?" she asked. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the railing. "I spent a long time thinking marriage meant control," he said. "Structure. Stability through management." Sara didn't interrupt. Didn't need to. He continued. "I thought if I could keep everything in place, nothing would go wrong." He shook his head slightly. "Turns out, that's not how it works." "No," she said softly. "It isn't." He looked at her then. "Now I think it's the opposite," he said. "Opposite how?" "It's not about limiting the variables," he said. "It's about allowing them. Letting things matter. Letting someone matter. Enough that there's something to lose." Sara held his gaze. There was no tension in it. Just attention. "And that's not something to control," he added. "It's something to protect." The words settled between them. Quiet. Honest. Unforced. Sara studied him for a second longer. Then took a small step closer. "You learned that without a spreadsheet?" she asked softly. He huffed out a quiet laugh. "There may have been an early draft." "I'm sure there was." Pause. Then, "I'm glad you didn't stick with it." "Me too." The moment lingered. Not stretched. Not forced. Just present. Sean reached into his pocket. The movement was subtle enough that Sara almost missed it, until he turned fully toward her. "This isn't a grand gesture," he said. Her brow lifted slightly. "That's good. It's just something." She waited. He held out his hand, opening it to reveal a simple ring. No dramatic flourish. No audience. No announcement. Just this. Sara's breath caught, not sharply, but softly. "Sean, I know what this is now," he said, his voice steady. "Or at least, I know what I want it to be." She didn't look away. "And I don't expect anything," he continued. "I don't need an answer right away. I just—" He stopped briefly, searching for the right way to say it, then found it. "I want to keep building this with you," he said. "However that looks." The ocean moved quietly behind them. The light shifted, softening around the edges of the moment. Sara exhaled slowly. Not because she needed time, but because she felt the weight of it. Not pressure. Not expectation. Just significance. You're very bad at not making things meaningful, she said. I've improved, he replied. She smiled, then reached forward, closing his hand gently around the ring for a second before taking it from him. I don't want what we had before, she said. I know. I don't want a version of this that feels confined. You won't have that. I want this, she said, her voice steadier now. What we've built. What we protect. Sean nodded. That's what I'm asking for. She held his gaze, then smiled fully, easily, completely. Okay, she said. Later, when the sun had disappeared entirely and the ship settled into its quiet nighttime rhythm, they stood side by side again, the ocean stretching endlessly in front of them. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Sean glanced at her. You know this means we have to keep doing the birthday cruises. Sara didn't look at him. Obviously, she said. Good. A pause. Then, and next time, she added. You're planning at least part of it. He smiled. We'll see. She nudged him lightly. You're doing it again. Thinking. Yes. He leaned back against the railing, the quiet settling comfortably around them. Yeah, he said. This time, she said. I don't mind. And for once, he didn't try to explain why.